Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki koutou, e na raurangatira mā, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai, ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Kotaho, ko te kairahi o Putea Whaiwhakaro, nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. A very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm CEO for the charity Mindful Money. We are an organisation that aims to make money a force for good by providing radical transparency for KiwiSaver and retail investors, so anyone can see what's in their investment portfolio. And we undertake these seminars in order to educate the public and the finance sector and highlight how investment can make a difference on issues that matter. Tonight is the 15th seminar in the second series, and you're very welcome to see our recordings, our website for recordings on climate change, net zero, social housing, impact investing, investor engagement, investment in Russia, nuclear weapons, and last week, investment in animal welfare, or rather avoiding investment in things like animal testing. So tonight we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at a category of investment, commercial buildings, that have a significant impact on the quality of life in our urban centres, and they account for the largest share of carbon emissions from the built environment, which amounts to around 20% of New Zealand's gross emissions on a life cycle basis. So as we'll hear during the seminar, standards for sustainability and environment can make a huge difference when green and sustainable property is considered. I'm going to kick off with the investment perspective, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Frances Sweetman. Now, Frances is Milford's Head of Sustainable Investment. She's a portfolio manager of New Zealand equities. Frances joined Milford in early 2017 as a senior analyst focused on New Zealand equities. And prior to joining Milford, Frances worked at Craig's Investment Partners, Brook Asset Management, Macquarie Bank in Sydney, and she has, as you will hear, a British background. So a very warm welcome to you, Frances.
Thanks, Barry.
So Frances, can you lead us off and set the scene for us on kind of investment funding into green properties?
Yes, and I'd like to start actually by outlining our approach to sustainable investment and then explain what that means for how we invest in property and green property in particular. And for us, we really invest in companies. We don't invest in financial markets. And we've always done really detailed analysis of what makes a company a good investment. And that includes a detailed analysis of the environmental, social and governance, or ESG factors. But what we've realized as the impact of climate change and also the global social harm that we're seeing has become more and more prevalent is that we have a bigger duty than that. We need to do more than just look at ESG from a risk and opportunity for the companies we invest in and actually play our part in moving to a more sustainable and just society and economy. So that's where we stood back and said, hang on a minute, how can we play a part in this transition? And we decided that encouraging all the companies that we invest in to decarbonize and become more sustainable through engaging with them is how we can best do that, because we are an active manager and we are reasonably large and influential in New Zealand and increasingly Australasia. And the bit that we really love about that is that we have the opportunity to engage with all the companies that we invest in and try and help transition all sectors, not just the key ones. But that said, we don't engage without consequence, and we won't invest in companies that ignore sustainability risks, that won't play their part in transitioning to a more sustainable future, or in fact won't engage with us and take on board our feedback. So we can use our exclusions list and will sell and put companies on our exclusions list if they won't do that. And it's those two things together that we think give us the maximum influence. So I'll just touch on what engagement actually means and how we do that, and what that means for what we do in property companies. So we want all companies to have a decarbonising target. And there are some fantastical global organisations that can help investors group together and increase influence on delivering that kind of effectiveness towards companies targeting their emissions, like Climate Action 100 Plus. And to be honest, this is the minimum that you should be expecting from your KiwiSaver provider. We also want all companies to report your emissions, report what you're doing, because without reporting it, we can't see it, we can't judge you on it, and we can't encourage your actions in that area. But the main one, which is why it's highlighted so big in the middle, is we want companies to act. And this is the bit that's really hard, because we need to be able to judge what genuine commitment to sustainability is, what the minimum requirements are, and what best practice actually looks like. So we can take all of that to each company and have a really educated and strong debate with data behind it to really push companies to do better. So that's where we focus most of our time. So what does that mean for green property? Well, the first one is about reporting, and there are some really good, thorough, clear and well-recognised rating systems for buildings, both existing buildings and new buildings, like Neighbours, Green Star and GRESB, and all of them we rate really highly. So we want companies to just get their buildings rated and report what those ratings are, and then we can all understand what the emissions of those buildings are by tenants, investors, and talk a really similar language on that. The next part is existing buildings, and these are about 30% of that emissions burden that you were talking about earlier, Barry. And the best way that we think property owners can decarbonise their existing buildings is, particularly in New Zealand, where we've got this fantastic renewable energy source, is electrify them as much as possible and where you can. It's difficult, but we want companies to really try and move on that. And then also replace your heating, venting and cooling systems to be much more energy efficient. And they're the two really obvious ways that a building owner can decrease emissions really effectively. And then when it comes to new building design, the location is so important, because that can encourage lower emissions behaviour and more sustainability behaviour from all your tenants in terms of getting to work on public transport and using cycling and walking options. So that is really important to us. But then the other really big piece is trying to use sustainable materials. But what it means at this point is trying to use your influence to encourage the supply and the development of more sustainable materials, which is still a big work in progress. And so we think all big property developers have got a really big role to play in developing that supply chain. And then the one piece that I don't have in a symbol on this slide, which is really sort of the next frontier of what green buildings can deliver, is all those well-being and social benefits that are really difficult to pin down. But I think property owners do have the ability to actually help and improve lifestyles for all of us there as well.
Cool. Thank you very much, Francis. That's great. I will come back to a number of these points, but can you talk a little bit about the choices for Milford as to whether you invest in specific property companies, green property companies in this case, or whether you invest in a portfolio of green property companies, as seems to be the case for many investors these days? What's that trade-off look like for you?
For us, it's very company specific. So it's difficult to not naturally be attracted to really good quality companies with really good quality buildings. And that means green buildings. Tenants want green buildings. They're more, they've got much more longevity. They can charge higher rents. They can be more efficient and deliver better returns. So as well as being the right thing on every level, they deliver better returns to our investors, we think. So it's difficult not to be attracted to investing in those type of companies. We do invest in green property debt as well. So we invest in green bonds, But to be honest, it feels to us like green bonds is a fantastic instrument to demonstrate that you've got green buildings, but it's not. It's almost getting the benefit from what you already have. So we don't feel like, although that is helping the returns and the risk to our investors, that that's actually delivering any real improvement. What we like there more is sustainability linked finance and how that delivers a financial penalty to those property companies that aren't delivering on the commitments that they've made. In terms of portfolios of companies, we really look company by company, but we will invest in companies that have very mixed portfolios. And there are some property companies in New Zealand that have those, where not every building is rated, where there are some high emitting buildings. And that is really where we think our job is, to keep those property companies in a listed sphere where they're subject to the much higher disclosure and governance requirements and all those pressures that shareholders can put on them in that public arena, and really force them to decarbonise those buildings a lot more quickly than you might get in the private market.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move on and then have a look at Precinct in a little bit more detail. I'm very pleased to welcome, firstly from Precinct, Craig Stobo. The introduction to Craig could take most of the rest of the seminar. His CV is long and impressive. He's chair of major entities in New Zealand, including Precinct Properties, Local Government Funding Agency, AIG Insurance New Zealand, Elevation Capital Management, Saturn Portfolio Management, and New Zealand Wind Farms. He's also a taumata of Otago University Business School, and gives his time to a number of charities. So I'm not sure how he's got any time left after all of that, but Craig is also a keen ocean swimmer, sailor, and skier. So very warm welcome to you, Craig.
Kia ora, Tato. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Barry. It's very humbling. One of the benefits of being chair of the board is that we have wonderful executives like Elaine McKinney to join us on this call. So I'm in a tandem presentation on Precinct today, and it's a privilege to be here. So thank you, Francis, for your introduction on how the funds management industry sees commercial property. That's really helpful. Our slides today are going to go through 4 or 5 slides. I'll pick up the governance sort of side, and Elena will take you through some of the reporting issues that we are grappling with. So if I could just turn to the first slide, which is actually a slide on Leadenhall. If you just flick through one more slide there. And we've picked that slide because it's not that long ago, but it was 7 or 8 years ago, when this major building was put up in London. And you can see the carbon emissions and the equivalent tonnage of carbon put out in a car equivalent with steel and concrete. And the carbon emission costs of that style of construction are just something that we just cannot continue with today without compensating for those emissions, as you'll appreciate from the targets we have on a net and gross basis by 2030 and 2050. Barry's absolutely right. The built environment's very important. In New Zealand specifically, clearly ruminants are a major part of our emissions issues, around about 50%. And the next 2 categories are transport and the built environment. So we think we have a responsibility at Precinct to think clearly about our role in society to bring down those emissions. And the next few slides will go through how we think we can do that. So sustainability at Precinct, how do we see that? Well, you can read the slide for yourself in the words underneath sustainability at Precinct title, and the intersecting diagram on the right-hand side as to how we see our people and our operations and our sustainability thesis. That's relatively straightforward. I'm going to apologise in advance for the kind of language we use. It's quite technical, and I don't want to apologise for it in some senses, because we're going to get hefty used to these phrases as we discuss sustainability in real estate. But what we've done in a governance sense is set up an ESG committee run by one of our directors, which has other board members on it. It's a full board committee of the board, like an audit committee or a REM committee. So that's our commitment at a governance level, and that's supported by a management sustainability committee, which is looked after by our CFO, Richard Hilder. So that's a kind of governance piece. And then we come down to questions of disclosure and how we disclose. And this is the sort of language that I want to discuss with you that it is going to become increasingly important for investors to understand. So we report under several frameworks. One of them is the GRI framework, which is the Global Reporting Initiative framework. And that's not generic. That is generic and not specific to real estate. And that's helpful for understanding what things we focus on. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is mandatory for us. And we're looking forward to the External Reporting Board standards on that, which is up for consultation currently. And then we drop down to a thing called GRESB, which is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. So we are conscious that we're part of a New Zealand investor landscape, but actually we want to benchmark ourselves against others around the world. How well are we doing versus the Australians or versus the Asians, to give our global investors who invest in Precinct an indication of how we stack up in language that they understand. CDP is a global disclosure framework for investors, another thing we report against. And then, of course, MSCI benchmarking sort of goes without saying. The last one is NABERS in there, and NABERS is an energy efficiency rating. So how efficient are our buildings, which goes to Francis's point around electricity use and loss of heat. So are our buildings efficient, and will our clients pay for those types of strength in terms of our energy profile? So we do try and measure and verify carbon emissions, and Elaine will talk about that shortly. We have certification from Totu in terms of our carbon zero. And we do go through an offset program. You'll appreciate that construction techniques haven't got to the stage where they have zero emissions profile. So we are, I believe, always going to have an offset profile at some point. And it's probably worthy that at some point we discuss this later on in the meeting. How do we manage our offsets in New Zealand? Bearing in mind that the Crown is looking to pay up to $8 billion in offsets globally to get our net reductions down by 2030. So while gross emissions in New Zealand is going to rise, net emissions will meet that target, but we're going to be paying $8 billion of taxpayers' money with global offsets. And I think we should have a societal discussion around whether that's appropriate, because the alternative is to use more local offsets such as forestry, which is, of course, a great debate. So at this point, I think I'll just move through to TCFD and make sure we understand the next slide, which is the regime we're required to report on. Established in 2015, consistent framework, provides standard information for investors, lenders, insurers, and stakeholders. There's different elements to that. And I think I've already mentioned the XRB reporting standards that will be required to be met during the course of this year with consultation. But it will be mandatory. So we will have to report this. And I think we are very keen to get ahead of the game to understand what we look like at Precinct. And you'll see that we've already reported on that in our most recent annual reports. I would, before I introduce Elaine, say this is a journey for us. We don't have all the answers, but we think it's very important. And we also know that our clients want this. So between our clients and our investors, there is no choice. We have to do this. So at this point, I'll hand across to Elaine. Elaine.
Cool. Let me just introduce Elaine. Elaine McKenna works for Precinct Properties as the project director for the Wynyard Quarter Innovation Precinct. That development will total nearly 84,000 square metres when completed. So as many of you know, it's a huge part of Auckland's downtown development. Alan is passionate about the science of sustainability and drives ESG strategies and sustainable design across Precinct's business. And just as a kind of personal note and an interesting career move, Alan took a break to construct a hotel and golf course at Te Arai Mangawhai in 2020 before returning to Precinct. So welcome to you, Alan.
Sure. Thank you, Barry. Thanks very much. Yes, I think Craig was very right in saying this is a journey or a bit of an exploratory operation for us in terms of the emissions monitoring and the like. I think if we can get the slides back up, I'm going to talk about the issues that we have in constructing new buildings and the and how we're monitoring emissions moving forward and how can we go to reduce those. As you can see, it's quite a blunt fact that natural gas makes up a huge amount of our own emissions from all our buildings, and our second highest use is electricity. So what we're doing as a business is looking both now and in the future, and actually so beyond technology to see what we can do. We're obviously moving to degas our buildings. That's the first and I wouldn't say easiest, but the first thing we can do. The second thing is actually looking at the HFC consumption. Your fluorocarbons are a dirty word, and but they're also very efficient at cooling and heating our buildings. We are starting a phase-out program next year. However, one of the problems with the replacement to the fluorocarbons are that, with a rich sense of irony, they don't perform as well. They're not as efficient. So therefore, the plant has to work harder. So therefore, we use more electricity in cooling the buildings with the new coolants. So moving forward in terms of the other consumption, electricity is obviously a major one for us as a landlord. In Wynyard Quarter, we have installed a solar array in our latest building, and it is just pumped straight into powering the common areas of the building. The problem with high-rise buildings is that you don't really have much room for photovoltaic panels. So we need to look at alternatives. And at the moment, we're exploring building integrated panels. And these will be on the facade. And in the future, we'll be looking for photovoltaic panels that are integrated into the glass itself. So suddenly an office building can be quite a large solar array. So these things we have to start looking at almost in a pre-design phase. Your building power usage, while we have reduced it very well in the likes of Mason Brothers, generally power, kilowatt hours per meter hasn't really changed from the 70s. What has happened is that the buildings have got more glass on them, and with more glass becomes more heat gain, and that increases the need to cool the buildings. So what we need to start thinking about is a sea change in how we design buildings and what buildings look like. My facilities director, he describes it as just a glass T-shirt on the buildings now, and they are naturally quite inefficient, and it's actually looking to change the look of buildings, and we're going to have to do that if we're going to have to get greener. Moving on to the next slide. Craig touched on the GRESB side of things. GRESB we've found has been essential to our business in terms of taking a good look inwards at what we do, how we do it. The reporting is extremely thorough, and actually in quite a disappointing manner, the benchmark changes every year. So while we look to improve year on year, the scoring and the weighting of the scoring changes depending on where technology is. So it's a forever moving topic, and really does move with the with technology and with the process of owning and managing buildings. We're very proud of our scores. We stay above the global average. We're working very hard at that. Obviously, our new portfolio performs extremely well, but it's trying to get the older portfolio up to speed, and that is a real challenge. And that's where we're looking through. And Craig was good enough to talk about to mention it. Our carbon offsetting we have a process where part of our carbon offsetting actually goes back into improving the rating and efficiencies of the buildings. So it's a constant investment process that we're doing, and we can get into that in a little bit more detail later on. As you can see from our assets, we're pretty good. As I say, the new buildings all perform at 5-star, Green Star, and 4.5 neighbours and above. We have one building at 5.5 neighbours, which is an outstanding score. And we can just look to try and repeat that technology and improve it as we go on. Neighbours, just as a very brief overview, it is the sticker on the fridge door, which shows how efficient the fridge is. It's the building equivalent. In Australia, it has to be shown on the buildings, and I think we should be looking that way as well. It's a very, very good way of seeing how well a building is performing. Green Star, in turn, is how the building is built, and that is something that we've grasped in the last 6 or 7 years, and it's now the mainstay of our business. I can wind up there, and we can start, I think, to take some questions, if that's all right with you, Barry.
Yes. So let me just lead off with a few things and kind of welcome back to Craig and Francis. We'll bring the panel together. Just maybe as a follow-on question to you, Alan. Some of our audience may not be so aware of the various rating systems. So I guess worthwhile just kind of running through. Neighbours is primarily the energy efficiency score. And I guess, for example, the government has said that they won't tenant buildings that doesn't have a Neighbours 4-star rating. Is that correct?
That's right. And I think it's as a landlord, it's an extremely useful benchmark. The operating efficiency of the building is everything. Ultimately, we want to reduce all outgoing costs, and if it's a gross lease, then that's great for us. But ultimately, if you can get a building more efficient, you don't need as big a plant room. If you don't have as big a plant room, you don't need as much steel. You don't need as much pile, and so on. And it's almost like a Formula One analogy. It's about making them light and efficient, and it's a very difficult job because the efficiency of a building tends not to run hand in hand with the looks or the design of the building. And it's getting those teams together, and it's very important.
And then Green Star rating is around the construction of the building.
Green Star's construction. So it's recycled materials. There's specific requirements as to how we even market the building, the concrete that is used, the specific internal materials. It is a very, very rigid scoring system, and it's on a Green Star design and then a Green Star as built. We've always gone with the as-built because it's quite easy to design a 6-star or a 5-star Green Star building. It's much more difficult to build it because you're actually at risk until you get your score. So we're getting better, and our contractors coming along on the journey with us. And in this instance, it's Hawkins, and they've been extremely good.
And then I guess for the audience, so the Neighbours. Operational efficiency and the construction scores essentially make up a fair bit of the GRESB rating system. Oh yeah, it's international rating system.
Yeah, it's one of 100 benchmarks. As I say, the level of detail that GRESB goes into is phenomenal, and it takes a team of about 3 or 4 people in the office, and it takes them about 6 months to get the data together to get it entered. And we're getting better at that. The first time it was extremely daunting, but we're getting used to it now.
So just again on the operational side, Alan, are you constrained by the existence of materials that you will be able to use in order to design to, for example, a 6-star green building status? Do you have in New Zealand the range of materials that building materials that are required, or is technology required in order to help us?
We are restricted in some cases. Cross-laminate timber is all the rage. It's what we should be. We're building one of our new buildings down in Wynyard will be built out of timber. It's very difficult to. We just don't have the volume at the moment to bring the cost down. Recycled concrete certification. We have actually had to carry out the certification for our concrete supplier because they don't need to. They have so much demand. They're not required to recycle concrete. We're having to make them and actually do the certification as well. The government change to a minimum neighbours requirement on their buildings has been very useful because that brings it into the spotlight. That's a key move, and it'll become the norm. And what's happening is that existing buildings have to score a better neighbours score over the years. So by 2025, I don't think your building will be considered green unless it's 4.5 stars or over. And bearing in mind, one of our most advanced buildings was 5 stars 6 years ago. It shows how the market's moving. So that's a challenge, and it really is.
Craig, can I come to you in your governance role as chair of the board? All of these construction standards and neighbour standards, Green Star standards, are basically adding to your costs of operations. Do you get worried as a board that you're not going to recoup those costs in higher rentals or building value? And how does this play out in terms of profitability from reaching for the higher standards?
The answer is, do I think about it? Absolutely. However, you follow the clients, and the clients are demanding this. Our investors are looking at sustainability for their own funds. So in some senses, there's no choice. You have to find ways of delivering to client needs with innovation, creativity, etc. And that's the role of the development part of our business. But we have buildings that have got existing clients in them that also need to be refurbished. So it's not just new stock that Elaine mentioned in Wynyard Quarter, it's also the existing stock. And that requires a change in discussions with clients around, well, we could do this, but you're going to have to pay for it. So you have that trade-off. But the market is moving one way, and I don't think there's any choice. So we're in a very good position with our client mix where they are looking for these changes. I will say, it may not have come through strong enough so far, but I think in the 12 different sectors in the economy that are measured by stats or global classifications of industries, construction hasn't really changed in terms of productivity and innovation, I would argue, since the 60s. So we are having to work with industry that has not changed much in the way of its techniques and bring them into the 21st, 22nd century with new ways of thinking. And that's a challenge for us as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you see as a chair that driving higher standards can give you an advantage over competitors in your industry?
Absolutely. The trick is finding the clients that are willing to pay for that privilege of being part of our Precinct community, our clients. So that will continue to evolve, and I just don't think you can go backwards. So having relatively new quality stock available for our clients who can revolve around our portfolio to get the sort of combination they want is critical. So we're in a good position.
And I understand there's a limited number of commercial building companies that have GRESB scores, and you're one of a few. That's
correct. That's correct.
Does that help you attract overseas capital as well as New Zealand investors like Milford?
Well, we've announced in the last period a third-party capital JV with GIC in Singapore, which is public information now, and they see us as the logical partner for what they want to do in New Zealand with what we can offer. So the answer, Barry, is yes. We are held in high regard. We are on the ground here doing things that are globally attractive, and we have a major institutional player that wants to work with us. So I think that's an indication of the strength of our offering.
Yeah. I guess part of the theory for high ESG standards is it's going to attract pools of capital from overseas as well as mobilising them from New Zealand.
Absolutely.
Partly because of the big wave of ESG investing that's going on around the world.
Yeah, it's also not a branding issue. You actually have to report against it and do the mahi. Like it's not a marketing exercise. You've actually got to deliver and show that you're making progress, and they are interested in that.
Francis, coming to you, if I look across most sectors of the economy, very few of them have data and standards in the way that commercial buildings do. I mean, I was struck when I started looking at this. There's NABERS scores and Green Star scores and GRESB, as you said, Ellen, it's got 100 different measures. This is a really measured sector. Does that help you as an investor to be able to have the metrics that you can then compare companies in a more quantitative way?
It helps us hugely. That level of disclosure and understanding around what a building is actually fundamentally delivering, and not to the extent that Alan has, but we've done a big research project into understanding the fundamentals of these ratings and how we compare them across our global holdings and which are more thorough than the others, has really helped us understand what a building is fundamentally delivering. And so it just helps us not only understand how we can go and engage with those that aren't delivering it, but also just the risk and the return profile of those buildings that we're investing in. Yeah. And we do a lot of industry sector research across everything that we invest in, but a couple of examples just in the last few months that we've heard in terms of the New Zealand office sector, from a leasing agent from one of the major big property brokers, said that last year under 5%, I think was the statistic off the top of my head, of their leasing was done in buildings that were not green. And in Sydney in the last 10 years, the net absorption, which is the net change in floor space that's occupied of the Sydney market, has been negative for buildings that weren't green and majorly positive for buildings that are green. So being able to see the ratings across all those buildings actually enables us to be able to quantify those sorts of financial metrics that we can then quantify the earnings and the financial performance in our funds. So we can look at tenant demand and we can talk about vacancy risk and all of those different things. So it helps us on a number of different levels.
Yeah, we're about to have some better reporting and better disclosure on climate impacts, and no doubt that will help with disclosure, but I bet you wish you had these kind of measures for many of the other sectors where you're having to look at ESG factors where the data just doesn't exist.
It's one of the hugest challenges for investment managers trying to actually invest green, is that the amount of work, and we're lucky at Milford that we're a really big team, so we've got the resource to do it, but many don't, and the amount of work that goes into actually understanding the genuine green credentials of a company without that mandatory reporting is very difficult. And that's why a lot of investment managers can only really use exclusions in order to actually make sure and certain that the companies that they're investing in are green.
Now, I wanted to ask a question that's addressed to both you, Craig, and you, Francis, which is, how do you get on? You know, as an investor, you're trying to, as Milford, as you said, to try and influence ESG standards, to raise them in the companies that you invest in. And Craig, you have a desire to maintain high ESG standards. what kind of dialogue do you have? What opportunities are there? Do you just meet around annual general meetings? Do you get together for coffee, or is it formal processes through the board? What happens? What's the dynamic between a chair of the board and an investor?
To be frank, Frances has come into the boardroom during our internalisation phase, discussing governance issues. Was the last time I had the meeting with her. So there's a contact at that level on specific issues that affects governance. But there's a very strong relationship between the fund management community and our executives through quarterly calls, one-on-ones, where there's an update required, for example, on what we're doing. That's public information or clarification of public information. But I'd like to think, and Frances can tell us frankly whether that's the case or not, that Precinct has a very high level of quality reporting on what we do, and that's available to all investors. And we'd like to think that relative to our local peers, that puts us in a very strong position. As I said, we're on a journey. We're not finished, but we'd like to think we're well on the way to give investors like Frances at Milford what they need to be able to communicate with their investors.
Yeah, I mean, Precinct is such an easy one to talk to, because we can have a really grown-up conversation about what we as investors want to see. And this is both with Craig and also with the management team, and the challenges that Precinct have got there, and how we can kind of all work together. Us as investors providing support, say, for buildings where returns may not be as high as if you had used non-sustainable materials, but we get the benefit of that through the risk reduction over time. And they can talk to us about they're delivering as much as they can deliver, and we need to understand the time constraints and the material constraints. And it's a really positive, good conversation. It's not always like that. For the most part, companies are willing and open to talking to us, but there are those that aren't doing as much as we would want them to do. And it's an ongoing conversation and process that can be at some points a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. So remind me, we'll have a seminar in future with somebody who you have difficult conversations with. But can you tell us a little bit about how those difficult conversations go, and how some of the relationships can, in a way where you're being a bit more of an influencer rather than a supportive partner?
Yeah, and one thing we do in Milford is we've got sort of two parts. We've got the bit where we have a covering analyst of the company, and we turn up at every meeting with management, and we always make sure we talk to them about the most important ESG issue that we've worked out through our sustainability research. And then we have another part, which is those companies that we don't feel are doing enough. And that's where the sustainability team steps in and does additional meetings. So we do run a little bit of a separate process through that. Those conversations are always long and involve quite a lot of long pauses, where generally we find the approach is to try and understand the issue first and make sure that we're not flying in with a helicopter view and missing something. And so there's always a good few meetings that take a few months of these explanatory processes. And then we move to making the recommendations that we want to make. And the companies that we find we have a little bit of pushback with are those that want to make a certain amount of effort, but don't want to impact returns or impact customer demand, or cause that sort of friction in the easy running and profitability of their business, that pushing more forward with more aggressive ESG strategies would require. And I understand that, particularly for listed businesses where a lot of your shareholders are very much returns focused. Then our job becomes about trying to reassure these businesses and educate them that being more ESG positive will actually probably result in better shareholder returns over time, and trying to take this longer term risk adjusted focus and reassure them that we're going to give them investor support in order to do that. Now, our success depends on our size and our influence, but we do find that can take a long time and be quite a number of conversations.
Okay, good. We've got a question come in, so I guess this is to you, Craig, or maybe Alan as well. Are you noticing your tenants are willing to pay higher rents or a green premium to be in your highest rated buildings?
The answer is yes.
And alternatively, have you seen a brown discount for those that don't have high?
Yeah, there's differing a tiering, not just location, amenity value. There's also a recognition around what the staff in those clients want to be associated with, so that it's not just the new younger people, it's a broad spectrum of people recognising that their contribution can be direct or indirect through the company that they work for. So that's quite strong, and in some cases it's a de minimis requirement. That's what they're looking for when they look at new leases. So absolutely.
And presumably you have some data around job satisfaction, kind of experience of your tenants in buildings of different standards.
Yeah, so the qualification for 6 green stars at Mason Brothers, we had to survey the companies before they moved in and after they moved in, and some quite shocking results in that. I think there was between 20 and 25% reduction in absenteeism, which is certainly I could rentalise that. The other thing that we looked at was an interesting one, but there was a perceived increase in productivity as well. So that's very accurate at 8.3%, but there we go. But so there's a lot of things are happening in these modern buildings. We tend to provide about twice as much fresh air as is required, and what that does is you're more alert, you're working better, there's less chance of illness, etc. And that's got to be key to the well-being of staff. We have very large bike rooms and end-of-trip facilities, so people are cycling into work, and just there's an ongoing effect of being in a modern green building that is pretty hard to analyze. But as I say, this pre and post occupation survey that we did we've been repeating often because the results have been amazing.
Yeah, I've been into the Masons building, and there are nice kind of public spaces in there where people can have conversations, and I'm sure it's good for internal communication as well. We've got another question come in, and it asks about the S in ESG, about the social issues. So the question was, how much weighting does social factors have in the GRESB ratings? That it's very easy to have the hard data on environmental variables. Perhaps the social variables are not quite so easy to quantify.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. ESG is obviously environmental, social and governance. Ellen and I talked a little about this before the presentation, and we are thinking about kind of issuing debt with a social focus. Not sure what that means, not sure how far we're going to get down the track, but there seems to be something in there that we should be exploring. We don't have an answer yet, but arguably the S and the ESG needs more work by us, and we're quite keen to explore that. So yeah, great question. Don't have an answer yet, but the board's onto it with management.
Yes, I mean our carbon credits, rather than buying in forestry and the like, which is quite common, where we look to, and it's a global gold standard, but a lot of that is pulling people out of poverty and preventing a carbon reduction through burning of charcoal, etc., for cooking and the like, and that's where part of our carbon credits are being invested. So we're looking to try and do that in New Zealand. I think we need to look closer to home, but at the moment that product is pretty hard to come by.
Okay, so we're about to have to close off our seminar. So if anyone's got a burning last question from our audience, please please chip in now. Perhaps back to you, Francis. The place for, I mean, we should have probably started off the seminar and saying the normal financial disclaimers to say that we're not encouraging anyone to invest in any of the products that they're seeing on screen tonight, and we're not offering financial advice in any way. But can you tell us a little bit about the role of green property in an ESG portfolio? What kind of role? What kind of I guess what kind of diversification does it give in terms of an overall portfolio? How does Milford see the role of property in a diversified portfolio, for example?
Yeah, great question. It does provide a great diversification benefit. It also provides a really good dividend yield for those investors that are looking for something that's lower risk and can offer them a bit of income and return. So it's fantastic for that as well. Over the longer term, what it does as a sector that does provide a bit more of an income focus and a lower risk is that it also manages to provide somewhat of an inflation hedge, which is really important at the moment in this high inflationary environment, particularly those high quality property, green property companies that have the ability to demand not necessarily rent premiums, but certainly fair rents that grow with the market, which is why we have this sort of quality bias, because those companies can mean that they are able to lift rents as inflation is high. And you don't necessarily see that from very defensive, high dividend yield paying companies. So they provide a really good mix within a portfolio if you can get a high quality green property company that can grow its rents.
Cool. Hey, I'm just going to finish off with the last question for each of you. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with their first assessment report since 2014. And basically their message is we're just about out of time. And so we need to accelerate change. And the question for each of you is, if we want to accelerate change, what's needed to do this? What are some strategies for change in the commercial property field in particular? Is it government intervention that we need? Is it education of the people who are your customers? Is it new technology? What's going to really push this agenda along to actually be able to realize some of the carbon reductions that are possible? Ellen, let me start with you.
I'm currently working with our architects and our engineers, looking at what we can do 3, 5, 10, 15 years from now, and what's the shopping list, what's the dream list of stuff we can do to buildings, and ultimately it's getting to a sort of net zero in construction. And yeah, I don't think we're going to get to net zero, but we can work hard on it. There'll have to be a sea change in how buildings are designed. Currently, they are very complex and very heavy structures, and we need to simplify them. And floor to ceiling glass, these things that feel like a must-have now, we actually have to re-educate and to come back and make the facades of buildings more efficient. It's a tough one. It's a very tough one, and it's almost. I'll get in trouble with architects on this one, but it's almost an engineering-led design, and then we make it pretty. And I think that'll be very, very difficult to do. And it's something we're looking at, and something I'm sort of trying to pull together a paper on, just to see what direction, so that when we're planting seeds for new designs and new buildings, that these are thoughts that we have from day one. Because they're very difficult. Once the building's been conceptualized, it's very difficult to then add or to improve efficiencies if you haven't done it from the very outset. So it's a sea change in design.
Craig?
I'm a big fan of the emissions trading regime. So I think allowing our New Zealand carbon units to rise in price is completely appropriate. I think it's appalling that the New Zealand government is willing to accept gross emissions to rise by 2030 and offset that by net purchase of offshore credits. I think that's a cop-out. And I think on the sectoral approach, while I appreciate where pastoral farming is at, ruminants have to be brought inside the regime. And finally, we've got to sort out global aviation so that we have a regime that focuses on emissions. So I agree with you entirely. It just seems the wheels of progress inside the Wellington bureaucracy and politicians isn't grasping the nettle of where we're at. And I thoroughly agree with you. We're not going fast enough.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, by the way, on international trading and how that is just a mechanism to let New Zealand off the hook in terms of our domestic emissions, and expensive to boot. Be much better to put the investment into accelerating change. How about you, Francis? What are your solutions?
Well, I agree with you as well. And where that investment needs to go, in my view, is into upgrading the grid to enable that electrification. And that is so key for so many of our high emitting industries. It's not going to solve all the problems, particularly high process heat. So, for example, steel, concrete, dairy, and that's where we need real acceleration of a high heat type solution like hydrogen. We have the ability for hydro-driven green hydrogen. Why are we not doing it? And if we could do that and use all our fantastic renewable energy sources, we would be so much further ahead than we are now. So for me, they're the real key things to accelerate and step change decarbonisation in New Zealand.
Good. Well, thank you very much to our panel, to Craig Stobo, to Ellen McKenna, and Francis Sweetman for that great discussion. So I really, truly have learned a lot about green property in the seminar. Mindful Money is also going to be doing some more work on this and looking at profiling some of the funds that specialise in green property, and we'll be incorporating that into our website in future. So that seminar's been fantastic for us, as well as hopefully for our audience. Thank you to our sponsors for the seminar series, to AMP, Booster, Generate, KiwiSaver, Harbour Asset Management, PwC, and Milford Asset Management. Special thank you to our audience. Please visit our website to register for next week's seminar, which is on standards for ethical and impact investment. So it'll pick up many of the issues that we've talked about here. Our panelists include Untitled Chapter, who's a partner of PwC and an authority on ESG standards, and Simon O'Connor, who's CEO of RIA, the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. So come along to the seminar and see how we can ensure that clear and credible standards can get beyond sometimes the greenwash and the misleading information. And instead, if we have these clear standards, we can provide assurances to consumers on ethical investment issues. So see you online 7:30 next Wednesday. Thanks again to our panel. Ngā manaki tanga kia koutou ka kite anō.
Kia ora tātou, thank you.
Thank you.